From CBC Podcasts and the Fifth Estate, Brainwashed is a multi-part investigation into the CIA's experiments in mind control. From the Cold War and MKUltra to the so-called War on Terror, we learn about a psychiatrist who used his patients as human guinea pigs and what happens when the military and medicine collide. Listen to Brainwashed on the CBC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is a CBC podcast.
Hi, I'm Nora Young, and this is the Spark Guide to Civilization. Each week in the series, we do a deep dive into a single issue in society, exploring how we've managed it over the course of civilization through technological innovation and design. On this episode from November 2020, our look at nostalgia. Throughout the pandemic, we've seen a resurgence of retro hobbies, things like bread making, tie-dyeing clothes, and going to the drive-in. It's almost as though in times of crisis, our natural response is to turn to the past as a way to cope. We at Spark are no strangers to that strategy, so we begin this show about nostalgia with our own nostalgic look at the many, oh so many stories we've done about nostalgia. Meta.
And now it's time for
a brief history of Spark stories about how analog tech was better than digital tech.
Typically, we start by looking backwards first.
We begin in the year 2009. That's when several experts, including Stan Lebowitz and Bill Buxton, joined us for an epic and exhaustive look at the QWERTY keyboard.
QWERTY got associated with fast typing, and it wound up dominating the market. And then once it became dominant in the market, it got locked in through this network effect.
It's good enough, and it's more than good enough. And if we're going to invest, rather than replacing something that works pretty well, augment and supplement those devices which are good enough and plug the holes where things are still pathetic.
In 2010, we were still hot on keyboards and nostalgia, but of a different kind, making retro-sounding electronic music through old games.
So my name is Leonard Paul, and I compose chiptunes. The look and sound that we're going for is sort of nostalgia, but not repeating the stuff that was annoying. And so the idea is to use the same tools or similar tools that they had way back in the days of like the first Nintendo system and make it so that you take all the aesthetic and the feel and sort of the good stuff, but you leave behind the bad stuff.
2010 is also the year senior producer Michelle Parisi joined the team, and also when we realized how passionately she felt about our growing dependence on digital devices.
I love cassettes, making mixtapes and like putting the tape recorder up to the speaker of the radio to record your favorite song when it came on the radio.
Or as I did, holding the cassette up to the television set to record the entire soundtrack to Planet of the Apes.
Sure, or doing that. Who's even going to look at these photos 20 or 30 years from now? And will these photos even mean anything to our children when they grow up? There's something about opening a big old roadmap that helps open up your mind, too. I started to wonder, do teenagers even write letters anymore? Do I really need an app on my phone that's connected to an air freshener on my coffee table that's connected to my fridge, which tells the air freshener to tell my phone to tell me that I need to buy milk? No, I don't need that. I open the fridge and I see I need to buy milk and I write it on a piece of paper and then I go and I buy milk with a $5 bill.
Keeping your devices untethered is one way of holding on to the past. Another is just holding on to those devices altogether, like Denis Grignon and his landline.
For me, this is less about being pragmatic and more about being romantic. It's about hanging on to my past.
I think there's a degree of nostalgia there tied to the notion of home, that's some sort of anchor. This is in my house, part of my identity tied to my phone number.
And then there's the nostalgia for a time when connection and communication was pre-tech, as in the case of dating.
My name's Beth Bailey. I study the history of gender and sexuality. The ability to find potential partners through various kinds of dating online services and social media has fundamentally changed how widely people can look and how much they have to invest in the process. All of the hand-wringing and wailing about what it means to live in a sort of casual text-based semi-hookup culture, that's a really different model, and it is enabled and shaped by the technological possibilities.
But is it that things are particularly confusing now, or have people always been sort of confused about what the rules are?
I think they're particularly confusing now.
Okay. Along with the end of courtship, there's a long spark history of heralding the death of reading paper books.
Our brain is a creature of association. We associate the screen with time on task, time off task, time on task. And so we have this mode of digital reading that is advantaged for doing things quickly, getting a lot of information, multitasking, but is disadvantaged for the kind of slow reading. So I think there's a richness to really understand the underpinnings, the kinesthetic, even the smell of reading, but also the, this tactile set of associations that we have with a book.
That was cognitive scientist Marianne Wolf reminding us why reading paper books is still best. And by the way, although most of us spend a lot of time reading on screens, there's evidence that people, including young people, still prefer to read paper books. Just one of the many, many spark stories tinged with nostalgia. But where did the idea of nostalgia originate?
The concept has probably been around as long as we have recorded history, because there are examples that you can find from more than 1,000 years ago in literature.
That's Christine Batcho, a psychologist and professor at Le Moyne College in Syracuse, New York. For several decades, she's been studying this longing for the past. In 1995, she created the Nostalgia Inventory. It's a survey that assesses how prone people are to personal nostalgia.
The term itself was coined. It was invented by a German physician in 1688. Dr. Hofer described a condition of military personnel who were away from home and were suffering from a longing to get back home. So, in effect, the word nostalgia, he put together from Greek derivations that really mean the pain of longing for home.
And so then how has our understanding of nostalgia evolved over time?
It turns out that he was the first to formally introduce it as a negative or unfavorable phenomenon. In fact, he was using it as a label for a physical or a medical disease, which he thought in the worst cases could be fatal. And apparently there were reports from battle zones of military people who were so depressed, longing to get back home, that they stopped eating, they stopped sleeping, they stopped caring for themselves, and could, the argument was made, even pass away. And as a little footnote, many physicians argued that this then was probably a disease peculiar to men. And what they meant by that was that the part of it where there was loss of appetite and loss of eating, and so weight loss, they described as anorexia, and anorexia was then seen as a male disease. A lot of factors contributed to it, but I would say primarily what happened was as transportation became infinitely easier and faster, along with different means of communication, technologically speaking, the idea of being so intimidated by being a distance from home started to weaken. As that happened, home took on a slightly different meaning than just a physical location, even though it retains some of that. Even today, people talk about their birthplace or their homeland, but the idea of home got broader than that, and it started to include family, friends, and also the events and the experiences we've had in that original place of birth. When that happened, home became more of a symbol for good things, and good things that were associated with the people we have loved and the people who have loved us, and had that peculiar specificity about it that it had something to do with your origins, therefore, in effect, with the past. That was the semantic drift that led nostalgia eventually to become to see as a longing for the past.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating story. And obviously we think of you're longing for it, so it's something positive, and yet nostalgia is this kind of complicated, bittersweet emotion. I mean, how would you describe what we mean by nostalgia?
I personally do define it as bittersweet, and I kept that emphasis throughout all the research studies that I've done. If you think about the algia part of the word, that does mean pain. It means suffering. So really, for me, I can't tease apart the two. You could either think of it as a blended emotion, as in, if you thought of it analogously with taste, we have bittersweet taste or flavors to things, where you put the two together. Other theorists would like to argue that it's more oppositional, almost like a love-hate relationship where you have opposing emotions. And one theorist thought of it this way: it's sweet because you're bringing back the joys and pleasures of those parts of your past that really were meaningful to you. At the same time, it's bitter because the past can absolutely never be recaptured. It's gone, and it's gone forever. So one of the triggers for nostalgia, when you think of it as longing for lost time, is this notion of time passing us by and not being able to hold on to it. The whole philosophy of saying you never step into the same river twice. You can't reverse time and you can't stop it. And so that to some extent creates anxiety or stress.
Are there other triggers for that sense of longing for the past?
There are a number of them that have been documented well in the literature. One, I think many people are experiencing right now in an increasing degree, which is separation from others, especially separation from those we've come to rely upon or those we love or love us. But even beyond that, just social isolation or social distancing in and of itself is a trigger. Loneliness has been shown to be a trigger for nostalgia.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think we get more nostalgic as we get older? Or maybe that's just me, but it seems that we do get more nostalgic as we age.
Well, you're probably right, but I think there's a little more to it. In my data sets, I noticed that there were two time periods in the lifespan where nostalgia is at an increased level. One is old age, but that's not even, in my opinion, at least in my data sets, not necessarily the greatest one. There's also one in early adulthood, maybe around 17, 18, and then going on in through the mid-20s. And that period tends to be highly nostalgic, which might surprise some people because it doesn't seem to fit the other image that we have of rebellious adolescents or adolescents who are striking out for independence and opposing authority and all those wonderful images that we have. Just as nostalgia is bittersweet and we have this ambiguity of emotions, adolescence has its own ambiguity of, I really want the security of my nice, loving home and my parents paying all my bills at the same time that I don't want to be them and I don't want them to boss me around. I want to be my own person. So there's this struggle during that time period for identity. Who am I really? How much am I my mother, my father, or my siblings, or whomever? And how much of me is totally unique and distinct? That's what we refer to as identity exploration. In some of my studies, I've found a correlation such that the more an individual is engaged in exploring their identity or their self-image, the more likely they are to be more highly nostalgic.
So beyond us as individuals, are there time periods or eras where we see more nostalgia as a society? And if so, are there things that characterize those time periods?
The time periods over history that have been associated with greater nostalgia tend to be times of great transition. And the transition can be because of changes in technology, such as the Industrial Revolution, or it could be because of threats to a way of life, such as war. So in a wartime situation, people become obviously very concerned about preserving not just their way of living, but preserving certain cultural values. So anything that threatens change, that is either unwanted change, unexpected change, or very rapid change. It is very stressful if you have to try to keep up with change that's moving more quickly than you feel you can adapt.
So do you think ours is a particularly nostalgic era? I mean, we're certainly living through an extraordinary period of technological change in particular.
I think that's one of the greatest paradoxes. I do believe we're in a very highly nostalgic time. I call it a paradox because we also love progress. We love technology. Everyone wants the newest smartphone. Everyone wants the best quality in digital connections, etc. We don't want to go back. And that's why my argument is nostalgia is not about retreating to the past. In fact, no one wants to go back and be a 3-year-old again or a teenager again. No one I've studied anyway in my research. It's more like saying it's wonderful to visit it again so we can almost make sure we haven't forgotten something important. It's like when you leave the hotel to go back home and you want to make sure you didn't forget something in the hotel room. So you go back to check, not because you want to live there, but because you want to make sure that if there's anything that you wanted to save, that you can take it with you. And that's what nostalgia is like. So in a time period like ours, when some people feel we might even be losing control over how quickly technology is changing, and perhaps we can't keep up with it, there is this longing for the simplicity and security when we were able to use tools, devices easily. But at the same time, paradoxically, we can't wait for the newest technology to come about.
I'm Nora Young, and you're listening to episode 3 of the Spark Guide to Civilization, all about nostalgia and why it's a natural response to crisis. On the next episode, we tackle attention. With an abundance of information and misinformation to digest, and so many bingeable TV episodes, video meetings, and TikTok dances, it's time to focus, people.
I think a question might be like, what have we decided to pay attention to? And what does that mean? I think it would speak to what could change or what should change. It's interesting to me, culturally, we'll either talk about something like doom scrolling, which is considered to be like something negative we do where we lose ourselves in this flow of information. And then something like TikTok, which is still, some people consider it to be like a mindless use of our internet time. But it has a sort of different valence to it, right? It's not considered the same thing as like doom scrolling. But in both cases, there's something about them that feels good in terms of you're lost in some flow of time where like you lose yourself in this, you're in a zone. And in that way, I think they're very comparable to each other, that I wouldn't say like any sort of technology holds our attention differently than another one. I think technologies that work right now are the ones that we're paying the most attention to, are the ones that allow us to enter them and don't ask for anything while we're entering them. And in some ways, this is a really relaxing experience for people, even if it produces heightened fear, or for others, it produces joy, like laughter, if we think of something like TikTok.
A look at how human attention has changed over the course of history and what affects our ability to maintain it. That's coming up next week on the Spark Guide to Civilization. But for now, I'm speaking with psychologist and expert on nostalgia, Christine Batcho, about what makes us yearn for the distant and not so distant past. I realize this is somewhat speculative, but do you think that idea of rapid change and maybe rapid technological change is something we could find in other eras? Like I was thinking, for example, of the arts and crafts movement in the late 19th century, which was connected to people feeling anxiety about the impacts of industrialization.
Yes, I agree with you. And I think there are conditions such as wartime conditions that also present that. And that's partly, too, because of what you just said in terms of technology changing that threatens our lifestyle. One of the things I did in my more qualitative research is I looked back at memoirs of individuals who had served in the resistance during World War II. I chose the Ukraine because it was situated in an odd circumstance between two different forces. When they looked back and thought about why they put their lives on the line, what gave them the courage? I mean, it was incredibly dangerous what they were doing. What would motivate that? And that fascinated me. And it was clear to me that one of the strongest motivations was this sense that they were afraid the lifestyle that they valued was being threatened, that they might never have the same world to live in. And so they were struggling actually to hold on to what they had always known, even though these were young people. Yeah. And so for the most part, it's that bump again in the adolescent nostalgia. And a lot of the nostalgia that motivated them came from the people they loved, because nostalgia is a highly social emotion. There are even collective forms of it where people come together and bond and become part of a community.
I mean, the thing about today is the past is so much easier to access now. I mean, we can indulge our nostalgia because of advancements in technology. So what are some of the common ways that people channel nostalgia now? And how is that different from the way we used to channel that longing for the past?
Social media in particular, those platforms have encouraged people not only to find and archive aspects of their own past, but then to communicate and share that with others. So in a way, you could argue that in the past, before we had this great digital technology, it's true that if someone was feeling nostalgic, they might pull out their old yearbook or family photo album or a box of souvenirs and go through it. And they might do that alone, or they might have another family member or friend, or maybe their partner with them doing it. But now think about it. As many friends as you have on your social media platform, you can reach out to so many. In fact, there was a huge fad where people reached out to the people they lost track of along the way. And that is a nostalgic yearning. It's a yearning for relationships that got neglected, not necessarily through anyone's own fault, but it's like whatever happened to. Yeah. And that journey is an incredibly interesting one that is facilitated, there's no question, by all of this digital technology.
Right now, of course, people are nostalgic for things that were around, just months ago. So what do you see in the current resurgence of nostalgia in 2020, and how is it different from regular old nostalgia?
I think part of what's happening is because there are limitations, restrictions. So people are searching for things that they can engage in that give them pleasure again. We're all seeking the joy that we had, to some extent, even the innocence we had before we had to deal with this pandemic. And so some people are retreating to old hobbies or old activities that they once enjoyed. It could be as simple as riding their bicycle again, or taking up knitting, or, painting something. And others are exploring new interests and reaching out to look for a new group on the internet that might teach them a new skill. They might take on something they've never done before. And now what are they looking for really? Yes, it's true that they're looking for pleasure and joy in that new activity, but they're also looking for social connectedness, which is a highly nostalgic thing to do. And they want first and foremost, a sense of belonging to a community. And that is highly correlated. Nostalgia definitely increases the feeling that you belong.
Yeah. And I mean, that connects to that idea of the analog and the tactile and the in-person. I mean, we learned pretty early on that Zoom meetings were a useful tool, but they are in some ways not really satisfying by way of forming emotional and social connections. So, and that seems to be what we miss most of all, is the ability to be just physically proximate with the other people that we love.
What's so interesting about what you just said is that one of the most basic behaviors of human beings is the hug. And before the pandemic even hit, there had become professionals who offered for a price a hug. And if you think about that for a moment, yes, you can get a free hug, but it tells you if there was a market for professional huggers, that there was a need that was not totally fulfilled in our culture, where some people felt that they needed human contact, human touch, physical touch. so much so that they were willing to hire a professional hugger.
Yeah. So ultimately, Christine, is nostalgia a good thing for us?
That has been debated ever since 1688 when Hoffer thought it was a disease.
Right.
When I first collected in my first studies data upon this, I was happily surprised to find that I found no evidence of anything negative. For example, I looked for whether it was correlated with depression or anything of that sort, and I found no connections with those negative things. So for the most part, this spawned a great deal. The research has been prolific. You can read volumes on this. And for the most part, people have found benefits. What are they? There are all kinds of wonderful things: social connectedness, feelings of belonging, continuity of self, a better understanding of one's identity, calming or a decrease in anxiety. Some studies have shown that it counteracts loneliness. It can elevate mood, especially in circumstances when someone is alone. In addition to that, I think of it as a pro-social, soft emotion. So correlated with it are the emotions such as compassion, empathy. And there have been recent studies showing that correlated with nostalgia are things like giving to charity, altruistic behaviors, volunteering more often. And so this is definitely a giving, loving, nurturing, other-directed. When I first started collecting nostalgic memory data, I found that most nostalgic memories, not all, but a large majority of them, central to them was the significance of how other people played a role in their life. It was all about the relationships. More recently, some of my data and the research of others is starting to ask questions, though, about are there limits to this, and are there situations or are there some people for whom nostalgia might tilt the other way and tilt toward the bitter part rather than the sweet part. And there are some reasons to believe that there are examples of that as well.
Right.
If society became more nostalgic, I don't think it would be regressive. I personally never thought that being nostalgic meant you wanted to go backwards. I just think it would be a softer, gentler, more compassionate, caring society. I think we would all benefit because we'd all reach out and care about the well-being of others.
Yeah. Christine, thanks so much for your insights on this. It's fascinating.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Christine Batcho is a psychology professor at Le Moyne College in Syracuse, New York.
I'm Nala Ayed, host of Ideas. In this age of clickbait and online shouting, Ideas is a meeting ground for people who want to deepen their understanding of the world. Join me as we crack open a concept to see how it plays out over place and time and how it matters today. From the rise of authoritarianism to the history of cult movies, no idea is off limits. Ideas is on the CBC Listen app or wherever you find your podcasts.
Enjoy a powerful business upgrade with Dell Technologies Black Friday and July event. Get amazing savings with up to 50% off high-performance computers and tech built for business, and be able to take your office with you with Windows 10 Pro. Plus, get great offers on Dell servers, monitors, docks, and more, all with easy financing options through Dell Financial Services. Call 877-ASK-DELL. That's 877-ASK-DELL, and speak to a Dell Technologies advisor today.
From The Spark, Archives, 2010.
My name is Todd Falkowski. I'm a design consultant. Authenticity is the biggest buzzword right now, and I think that we're finding this reach back into things that already have narrative and already have stories really is a shortcut way to do it. We all are curators, we're all archivists because of Google, and that phenomenon has led to this resurgence of looking back into our own little backyards and attics, seeking out that type of information to differentiate ourselves from everybody else.
I'm Nora Young. Today we're talking about nostalgia, longing for the past and past visions of the future. You might think nostalgia is a surprising topic for a tech show, given that we're often looking at the latest innovations, but there's a particular pleasure in looking back at how people in the past portrayed and marketed the next big thing. A future where everything is seamless and shiny, where nothing breaks or needs a firmware update. A future that never comes to be. The beloved primetime cartoon The Jetsons, which first aired in 1962. Set in 2062, it follows the Jetson family living a utopian future, a future where people live in homes in the sky, drive flying cars, work 3 days a week, and enjoy plenty of leisure time thanks to various labor-saving gadgets.
Thank you, and I love you people too.
The show was an amalgam of every promise of the space age.
The Jetsons was kind of parodying a lot of 1950s futurism that had come before it.
That's Matt Novak, a keen observer of this cultural phenomenon. He's a senior writer for Gizmodo and the creator of the Paleo Future blog, an ongoing archive exploring various imaginings of the future that never were.
Whether it's flying cars or jetpacks or meal pills, it's basically a way to look at history through the lens of futurism, but it's not just technology. You can look at social issues of any kind, really any topic, and take a look at how people thought the future was supposed to turn out. And sometimes it's fun to see what the difference is, but more often than not, it turns out to be a statement of people's hopes and fears. And I find that a very interesting way to look at history.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're talking about a lot of different visions here, but how accurate in general were these visions in predicting what turned out to be the actual future?
Well, that's sort of all in the eye of the beholder when it comes down to it. That's sort of the fun part is no matter how accurate someone's prediction from the past was, it's always off by at least a little bit. Great examples are like the video phone. The video phone was for a long time seen as sort of this dedicated appliance that would be in our homes that we'd, buy. But the video phone kind of snuck up on us. We got the video phone, but it's in all of our devices. It's not really a dedicated appliance like you'd buy a blender or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And so is it safe to say that those visions of the future tend to be more about the societies themselves in their time than they are about the future? If you see what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, and I think that especially when it comes to things like flying cars, what problem does a flying car solve? Well, it's a frustration with being in traffic for a lot of people. And that speaks to frustrations of those eras whenever people were predicting flying cars, and they were predicting them almost as soon as the automobile itself was invented. But if you look at predictions of flying cars from the 1950s and 60s, it was when a lot of congestion was happening. So it is fun to look at it through that lens of, well, why do people want to see this particular invention or change in society? And it often has to do with the period in which it was created. And I think a lot of sci-fi in general does that. Now, I don't necessarily look exclusively at sci-fi. Sci-fi is fun, but I sort of gravitate more towards the most earnest predictions, the kinds that you'd see in newspapers or magazines. Cartoons and sci-fi are a lot of fun and are definitely worth exploring, but there have been a lot of people that have explored that. So I started the Paleo Future blog back in 2007 and sort of gravitated towards the more earnest predictions of newspaper columnists or concept videos that different companies would put out where they'd imagine what pre-iPad might look like. Like those sorts of things always interested me, especially because I think that, like you were saying, sci-fi is often just a way to talk about the frustrations or the issues of a given time, and I think those make it a lot easier for people to talk about difficult issues. And that's certainly valid and it's interesting in and of itself, but I try and seek out as much as I can of people what they earnestly thought the year 2020 would look like.
Mm-hmm. So we're looking at nostalgia on this week's show, and I was trying to put my finger on what exactly is the pleasure of revisiting retro versions of the future? I mean, you've been at this for a long time. What do you think?
I think that, if you're old enough to have lived through different eras, you might find nostalgia in those. Like, for instance, elder millennials such as myself, I'm 37, might remember 1989 movie called Back to the Future 2, which had the hoverboard. I would have killed for a hoverboard when I was a kid. But I think that, a lot of boomers were promised, and this is, I think, the fundamental word here is promise. They were promised flying cars and jetpacks. And there's definitely a feeling, and this probably ebbs and flows with a lot of geopolitical issues at the moment, but futures are promises in some ways, especially to children. And I think that if you were of a generation that was promised a certain thing and didn't get it, I think that there's a sense of betrayal for a lot of people who were sold on a lot of ideas that didn't come to fruition, rightly or wrongly. I was surprised actually to learn when I really started to look into World War II futurism. I was fascinated by the sort of promises that were being made during World War II, some that you'd expect, but some that were being pushed simply as a war propaganda effort about the size of homes. And of course, we all know the story of post-World War II baby boom era, house and a picket fence and all that sort of stuff, and a car. But the more I looked into World War II futurism, I was fascinated by the ways in which the House of Tomorrow was sort of oversold in a way that some people even felt a little betrayed, that they didn't get exactly what they were promised.
One little robot, for example, always remembers to serve drinks when it sees anyone walking around with a thirst. A beam of light is aimed across the fountain and into an electric eye. When the beam of light is broken by a solid object, such as this head, the electric eye control opens the faucet, and there's your drink.
The new is always made up of the old, or rather what people see in the new is always the old thing, the rearview mirror. The future of the future is the present, and this is something that people are terrified of.
You're listening to Spark
from your friends at CBC Radio.
I'm Nora Young, this is Spark, and today we're talking about nostalgia. Right now my guest is Matt Novak. He's the writer behind a blog dedicated to documenting the history of tomorrow. When we think about past visions of the future, I think we immediately think about technological advancements, the holograms, the flying cars, the robots, and less about ideas regarding social changes and progress. But are there examples of futuristic visions that were primarily about society and the social order and social progress?
Oh, certainly. But that's typically something that you see in writing, in fiction, sci-fi, and it's not so much in the big Hollywood blockbusters. You see a lot of social change, especially at the turn of the 20th century, was sort of the dawn of women's rights in the US. You see a lot of sort of tongue-in-cheek editorial cartoons about what the future of your local bar was going to look like, for instance. And it was, one comes to mind where I want to say it was circa 1900 in maybe Puck or Judge magazine, two really popular magazines at the turn of the 20th century. It was a barroom filled with women, and this was meant to be a sort of dystopian image. So,
I don't know, it sounds pretty great to me.
But I think that, futurism also can have an extremely reactionary bent to it. And sometimes progressive ideas of futurism seem dystopian to future generations. One great example being the meal pill, which was invented by Mary Elise as this idea of allowing women to escape what she called the drudgery of the kitchen. And meal pills aren't exactly seen as a utopian promise today anymore. But it was a progressive idea that has its roots in liberation for women in the late 19th century.
Mrs. Jones is making out her menus for the week. She's got quite a problem.
And again, it all changes. Another example comes to mind. One of my favorite old comic strips is called Closer Than We Think. And it ran in, maybe 200 newspapers in the US and Canada. And just this bright, colorful techno-utopian vision of the future. And it was illustrated by a man named Arthur Radbaugh, who was out of Detroit. He made all these incredible illustrations for the big car companies, etc. But one strip in particular was about factory farms of the future. And this was a utopian. It has a guy in a lab coat, a scientist injecting a tomato with a needle, and they're sort of making the food of tomorrow. But that certainly wouldn't be a utopian image today. That would be something that people would be freaked out about. So every generation has different ideas about an ideal future, I suppose.
Yeah. So who comes up with these ideas of the future that are then embraced by society? Like not the sci-fi ones, but as you say, the earnest ones, because everybody experiences a time period differently and their hopes for the future might be different. Who comes up with these things?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Even within generations, there's a wide spectrum of different futures. By nature, people have different desires and different things they want to get out of life. So sometimes it's amateurs writing fiction, and sometimes it's columnists who are writing, what they think the future 20 years from now might look like. And one of the things that, again, you have to sort of remember when looking at these past visions of the future is that people in the past had a sense of humor as well. And futurism is often a way of parodying or talking about present day issues through this lens of futurism. So while we might take a look at the Jetsons, the original Jetsons first aired in 1962, 1963, and we might think, oh, that's what they really thought the future would be like. Well, in reality, a lot of it was poking fun at not only that, but the sitcom format and all sorts of other stuff. So while kids might absorb some of this media and think, oh, that's what the future is supposed to be, sometimes it reads differently depending on what generation or how old you are at a given time looking at the exact same piece of media.
Right. Right. Do you think that people still believe in the magic of technology the way they did perhaps in the 1950s?
Yes and no. I think that the sort of belief in the magic of technology is a bit overstated in the 1950s and 60s. I think we often forget that there are plenty of people who dissented at the time as well. A perfect example being the Apollo space program. We often today think of the Apollo space program as something that had 100% public support, which couldn't have been further from the truth. If you look through the newspaper archives of the time, people were making the exact same arguments that they would today about the space program. Why are we spending billions of dollars on this when people are going hungry and homeless people need homes? Why can't we spend that money here? I was actually shocked when I first learned about it because I had been hearing the stories for so long from boomers about this myth of national, if not international unity so in the West, let's say, to get to the moon, when in reality, the Apollo space program had lower than 50% approval rating throughout the 1960s.
Really?
Yeah. And it peaked in the months surrounding the moon landing in the summer of 1969 at, I want to say, around 53%. Don't quote me on that, but it wasn't above 60%. It was just over 50%. And that was after we landed on the moon. People said, yes, this is a good use of our resources. So your question of, do we have the same optimism for technology? I'd say we're probably roughly the same, to be honest. And people from this era will tell their grandkids their version of what happened when they were kids, if that makes sense. So if you're 10 years old today and whatever you remember now, we're obviously speaking about this in the year 2020, which is uniquely terrible in so many ways that it's hard to, I can't imagine what 10-year-olds are going to think of their time. But, during a normal year, things that would be up for debate may not be up for debate in the mind of a child. So I think that those are things that we always have to consider. And I think we understand it more today than we ever have.
People live in the rearview mirror because it's safer. They've been there before. They feel more comfortable. The present is an area that people have always avoided throughout all human history. The utopias of mankind are all rearview mirror images of the preceding age.
listening to Spark from your friends at CBC Radio.
I'm Nora Young, and right now my guest is journalist and retrofuture expert Matt Novak, talking about the various historical ideas, visions, and predictions of the future that exist, and what they tell us about the challenges faced by the different generations that formed them. So what are the harms of romanticizing the past then, and past depictions of the future? What should we keep in mind when we look back at these things?
I guess the harm would be thinking that today is necessarily that much worse, or that things are that much more broken. I think arguably things are more broken in a lot of objective ways in 2020, but I think everything is relative. So you can romanticize space age visions from the 1950s, but obviously pre-1964 Civil Rights Act, there are a whole host of issues that you have to keep in mind. And those social issues, I think, are coming to the fore a lot more than they used to. When I started my blog back in 2007, people were only interested in the shininess of the flying cars and jetpacks. But I think that even people who may have felt that way then are much more open to learning about the social side of futures and change within a society. Sometimes I think there's always going to be reactions to that, but I think it's funny because a year ago I might have had much more concrete answers, but honestly, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing in 2020. I really think that everyone needs escape, and I think how you achieve that escapism in a time of enormous upheaval, I honestly don't know that there's a downside to escaping into a world of flying cars and jetpacks when the world is crumbling and there's so much suffering going on and so much psychological trauma. I've started to approach my work that way, that on days when I really can't muster the energy to work, I try and remind myself that I can provide a service to people, helping people imagine a better future through these images of the past that are kind of fun. Because I've never been less certain about the future in my entire life, which is a very weird place to be.
Yeah, given that you've been writing about visions of the future for the last, these many years. Absolutely, yeah. So what are some of the ideas of the year 2020 or thereabouts that people imagined in the past? Are you aware of scenarios that they had about our time now?
Yeah, I searched through my site a little bit just to see about things. I've been doing this for so long. I wanted to see specific to 2020. And I came across an article that I wrote about a decade ago it was from 1967. I had found an article from 1967 that predicted that we'd be working a 16-hour work week by the year 2020. And the article was very concerned about how people would occupy their time. And this was something I've seen a lot in 1950s and 60s newspaper articles when they talk about the future and what ideas people might have to come up with to occupy people's time so that they don't harm themselves. That seems to be a recurring theme, that these social scientists were very concerned that people would be driven to suicide without any purpose in life. And work seems to be the avenue through which social scientists at least believe that people found purpose, and that if you just gave people money, and this is the other sort of funny part about these very mainstream 1950s and 60s newspaper predictions about the shortened work week. It's like, well, obviously we're going to have to give people a guaranteed basic income. It's fascinating to read this because, it's just such a mainstream opinion. Well, obviously once all the robots take over, we're going to have to give everyone a guaranteed income so that, because we're not going to make them push buttons all day. The robots are going to do everything.
Hundreds of these little robots are taking care of the routine tasks and leaving us free to live and work and play in greater ease and comfort and safety.
So I find that thinking really fascinating because, at least in the United States, guaranteed income is just blasphemy.
Well, and certainly in Canada, we actually had in the beginning of the pandemic a lot of conversations about how perhaps this demonstrated things like the need for a basic annual income. So it's almost like these predictions of the future are sort of weirdly accurate in a funhouse mirror kind of way, even though they weren't predicting anything like a pandemic.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. And, the other predictions for the year 2020 were robot chauffeurs, monkey chauffeurs, which I think came from the late 60s. Coincidentally, I think in 1968, which I think is the year that Planet of the Apes came out. I don't know if there was any link there,
Right,
but
yeah.
oh, and Olympics on the Moon in the year 2020. That came from a children's book that I found from 1979 that predicted there would be the Olympics on the Moon by 2020. Little did they know that the Olympics would be canceled for a pandemic.
Yeah. So overall, would you say that people tend to view the world and its future less optimistically now than they did? Or is that my own romanticizing of the past?
I think if you look at sort of North America in the second half of the 20th century, I would argue that, yes, we are less optimistic about the future today, because it seemed like there was a trajectory that even though things might move slowly sometimes, slowly but surely, it would seem like we were on an arc of progress a little bit. And that might be my own romanticization of certain eras when I was less politically attuned. But I think that, everything's relative. But I used to be able to think that I could speak about what mainstream American thought was like. After this presidential election, I don't feel like I'm in any position to say what mainstream America stands for anymore.
So finally, Matt, as someone who's thought a lot about the way we've thought about the future, do you have any thoughts about the visions of the future that may come out of the current challenges we face? I mean, especially the pandemic.
It's funny because so we have the Disney Plus app that I queued up the other day and saw a short Mickey cartoon that I played because it was the House of the Future. And I think if this cartoon speaks to anything, it's the fear of automation. It feels very 70s to me. There's sort of these ebbs and flows where you have technological optimism in the 1950s into the mid 60s. And then you have sort of these fears of pollution and fears of robots and those sorts of things into the late 60s and into the 70s. You've got Soylent Green, Future Shock. I feel like we are in a 70s period right now when things are pretty broken. And the Mickey cartoon that I watched, the House of the Future, starts with everything innocuous and fine.
Tomorrow's technology today? Guys, imagine the possibilities!
And it's got its robot servants and it's doing great. But slowly but surely everything starts breaking and the robot is taking over and it becomes very 2001: A Space Odyssey with domineering robot that wants to destroy, I'd say, humanity, but it's Mickey, so mouse kind, I suppose. But it feels very 70s, but somehow it feels even worse. And I think just the double whammy of the global rise of fascism and a pandemic is just too much for it not to feel worse, given the amount of suffering going on right now, whether it's food insecurity or homelessness or any number of issues where people are struggling. So I think it's going to be some time before we get back to more optimistic visions of the future. But again, it's hard for me to say. Never felt more disconnected from what I'd say quote unquote mainstream opinion is.
Matt, thanks for sharing your thoughts with us, and thanks for staying up late in Australia to talk to us.
Of course. Thanks, Nora.
Matt Novak is a senior writer for Gizmodo and founder of the Paleo Future blog. You've been listening to Spark. The show is made by Michelle Parisi, Olzi Sarakana, Samrawi Ioannis, and me, Nora Young, and by Christine Bacho and Matt Novak. And from the Spark archives, Todd Falkowski, Stan Leibowitz, Bill Buxton, Leonard Paul, Denis Grignon, Scott Henderson, Beth Bailey, and Marianne Wolfe. Follow Spark on your favorite podcast app, and you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, Spark CBC. I'm Nora Young. Talk to you soon. We've reached our special correspondent, me from the future. Future Nora Young, welcome. Thanks, Nora. Today in the future, plans to create a new time zone, Facebook Standard Time, or FST. Unlike most other time zones, FST will operate on a 27-hour clock. This new feature was announced at a media event held at Facebook's new headquarters, which until recently was known as the White House. Thanks, Future Nora. You're welcome, and good afternoon evening. Yeah, this has been
Technology news from the not-too-distant future.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.